I don't know if you've ever heard somebody talk about translations and they talk about a certain translation and you immediately feel it, in your chest and you think, oh, I don't like that translation. Well, my goal is to help us get away from that feeling and to look more into what is translation, what does it mean, how do you do it, and why does it matter all that much? So that's what I hope that we can do tonight. I know ancient Hebrew, I know ancient Greek, I teach it. I think most of you are aware of that. A lot of you here are in my classes. So I come at it from that perspective, right? So this is not me just like making things up or feeling like these are just fun things to say. And hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit tonight of how translation works by talking about these languages. So I've called tonight's class the challenge of translation because I really want to underscore how hard translation is. So this is our plan. For this first section here, I've split up the class into 3 sections. The first is math versus language. So we're going to talk about that. You'll see, I hope you'll see why that's relevant. We're going to talk a little bit about translation philosophy. So every Bible version has a translation philosophy. So we'll discuss that. And then we're going to look at the translator's contexts. And what I mean by that is every translator has their own situation that they live in. And that situation affects how they think and how they translate. We wish that wasn't how it was, but it is. And sometimes you can't always get rid of that bias. So I think that that's a helpful thing to just keep in mind as we look at different translations of scripture. This is the big thing that I want us to leave with. I've labeled it the core. So this is the main idea. And that is translation is complicated. And I think that there's a few things that we can take from this. Number one is sometimes we want to just grab like a Strong's and rewrite a verse based on what we find in Strong's. That's probably not a good idea. So that's number one. So that's something that I want us to take from that. Translation is complicated. It's something hard. You wouldn't go to Mexico and start telling everybody that the way that they're talking is wrong because you have a Spanish English dictionary, right? That just wouldn't be a good idea. And everybody would laugh at you and think you were silly. So that's something that I want us to take from it. Translation is complicated. And what that really means is, number one, we should be humble when we approach translating the Bible. And number two, we should use a lot of translations. So those are really the 2 big implications for what we're going to find. Okay, that's the main message. Question I think for us to think about is, why are there so many versions? You probably thought about this question before. Hopefully you'll get a little bit of an answer tonight, maybe a little bit of a different answer than what you have thought previously. So I'm going to go, as Chad said, I'm going to aim to go for about 45 minutes and we'll see how, and then we'll do some questions after that. So let's see how that goes. Let's talk about math versus language. Those of you that are in my language classes, you've heard me talk about this before. This is a passion of mine. So math is straightforward and logical. Now, oddly enough, I actually happen to be a math teacher, in addition to being an English teacher and a Hebrew teacher and a Greek teacher. I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about this because I live every day in math world and I live every day in language world. And it's kind of fascinating to see the difference between the two. So let me just put this up here. I tried not to be too scary for any of you. Can anyone figure this one out without using a calculator? If you've got an answer, you should just shout it out. All right, I'm gonna give you like another 5 seconds. Okay, you ready? The answer is 13. Anybody get that? All right. Now, here's the thing. There is no answer that is correct here other than 13. Now, I'll say this. I teach middle school math, okay? If any of you teach high school math or college math or something like that, maybe there is some other answer for X that I'm not aware of. I'll put that out there, okay? You might like blow my brain or something. I only go up to like 7th grade in the math I teach. So let's just put that out there. But as far as I'm aware, there's only one answer here. You know, X is going to be 13 and that's that. Okay, here's a simpler one, right? 9 times 9, that's going to equal 81. There is no other way, you know, unless you try and do some kind of weird thing with the numbers, some kind of like logic trick or something. 9 times 9 is going to be 81. There's one possible answer. That's how math works. English is not like that, right? If I were to say to you, what is your favorite food, right? You would probably give me a lot of different answers. Now, even if you had the same food as somebody else, you would probably answer differently, right? So I love hash browns. It's one of my favorite foods. So, you know, somebody could say something like this: hash browns are just the best. Now they could express the same idea here by saying, I love hash browns because they're so crispy. You might think this is strange to be talking about in terms of a class on Bible translation, but I think that this is important just in terms of understanding the difference between math and language, because often we approach translation like it's math. So we like to look at a word and say, oh, well, this word equals this. And that's not really how language goes. You know, you can't do that when you're working with language. So all of these sentences up here about favorite foods, that's supposed to say once when I was in New England, by the way, sorry. Once when I was in New England, I had the most amazing hash browns or something like that. Language can express similar things in totally different ways. And, you know, math isn't quite like that. There are different ways to go about things, but I want to just illustrate this now with an instance of translation. So take a look at these. Those of you who know Spanish, you might enjoy these. We have tengo hambre, me gusta el pollo, right? You know, so I live in Southern California. This is the kind of thing that we all learned Spanish in high school, a lot of us. So this is kind of my familiar turf as far as like a second language. So we have tengo hambre, me gusta el pollo, como se llama, right? So there's your Spanish. Now, if you were translating these like word for word, you'd probably end up with something like this: I have hunger, the chicken likes me, and how do you call yourself? Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? The chicken likes me would be kind of a weird thing to say. Really, how we would translate these would be like this: I am hungry, I like chicken, and what is your name? That's a big difference. In fact, the chicken likes me and I like chicken. That's like totally different, those ideas. One is the chicken liking you, the other is you liking the chicken. So this is why I think it's helpful to recognize that translation isn't really like math. I think we like to approach it that way because in some ways that makes it simpler. You know, it's like whenever I see the Greek word charis, then I know it means grace. That's it, right? And I'm just going to go and find wherever that word is, and I'm going to translate it as grace. We like to treat it like math, but it's not really like that. Translation is much more of an art. You know, there's times when you're translating and you translate in a certain way because that's how it feels like it should be translated. You feel it with the language. Like it's kind of a funny thing to acknowledge, and you know, maybe we don't like that it's not super scientific, but that is how language works. You know, you feel language. So I want to show you this. Let me show you now a biblical example, right? We've had enough of hash browns, enough of Spanish. So let's take a look at this. Genesis 1:1 in the King James Version says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Here's the New King James. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Anybody see a difference?
Plural.
What was that, Moretta?
Heavens is plural.
Ah, heavens is plural, right? Did anyone notice that? The heaven in King James and the heavens in the New King James. That's interesting. A little difference there. Here's the NIV. NIV says the same as the New King James. And here's the ESV. ESV, anybody notice a difference with the ESV? This is very subtle.
Why did they put a comma?
Aha, yes. So the ESV has a comma. Now, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really matter. But here's one of the funny things, like punctuation does matter, right? We talk about this in terms of the thief on the cross. Where do you put the comma? Today you will be with me in paradise. Or I say unto you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise, right? The commas didn't exist in the Hebrew, didn't exist in the Greek. So when translators are translating, they have to figure out all of the punctuation. So here are 4 different translations for Genesis 1 verse 1. The question is, which one's right? Now, here's what's funny about this. I'm going to suggest to you that these are all right. So check this out. That word there, the major thing that I want to focus on here as being different is heaven is singular in the King James, and it is plural in all these other translations. So should it be heaven or heavens? Well, what's funny about that is here's your word. It's Shemayim. Those of you that are in the Hebrew courses, you probably recognize that, Shemayim. That's your Strong's number, 8064. And if you were giving a dynamic translation, so one that thinks about idioms, you would probably translate it as heaven because, what does that mean? The heavens, plural. Like, what are there multiple heavens? Something like that. So I would probably, if I wanted to create a translation that would make sense to people when they read it, I would probably translate it the way that the King James translated it here. If I wanted to be literal, though, I would say heavens, plural, because that is literally what this word is. That word Shemayim is plural. Now, we could get even more literal, though. We could go even further into the Hebrew, because this isn't just the word heavens, plural. This is actually the word in Hebrew, 2 heavens. So if you wanted to say 2 heavens, that's what you would say, Shemayim. Now, any idea why none of our translations say in the beginning, God created the 2 heavens and the earth? Anybody want to venture to guess? That would be a totally literal word for word translation. Yeah, because it doesn't make any sense, right? In the beginning, God created the 2 heavens and the earth, and people would be like, what? 2 heavens? What is this talking about? Like, there isn't, you don't really see that kind of thing going on in scripture. So because of that, translators had to say, okay, what makes the most sense? And they go with that. So I hope that you can see a little bit here of this translation. It's not math. There's an art here, and it's kind of funny because you could look at this and you could say, well, here's 5 translations and there's differences between them, but they're all right. Okay. Now here's where we're going to make it a little more tricky, because that was just one word, right? Heavens. Well, the word heavens can be translated either as heaven or heavens or 2 heavens. But that's not that big of a deal because it's one word. This is the whole verse. Okay, here's the whole verse in Hebrew where it says Genesis 1:1 MT. You see that on the screen, MT. That means Masoretic text. So this is the Masoretic text. It's typically what we read in Hebrew of Genesis 1:1. So it reads, Bareshit, bara Elohim, et hashemayim va'et haaretz. So that's how you would read that verse in Hebrew. And I want to focus here on this word because I want to, again, illustrate a little further. We're going to drill a little deeper now to see that language and translation is complicated. So you could translate that phrase, Bareshit, you could translate it as in the beginning. We're probably pretty familiar with that because we're used to in the beginning. But if you wanted to be a little more literal, you would actually translate it as in a beginning. That's literally what it says there, in a beginning. And so if you read the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it reads en arche, which literally relates to in a beginning. Same thing. And John 1:1, you know how it says in the beginning was the word. It appears to quote from Genesis 1, and it says en arche, in a beginning. Now, that's not the only way this could be translated. So in the beginning is legitimate. In a beginning is legitimate. You could also translate it, though, as when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So that's one of those ones that, whoa, that totally reframes how you understand what's going on. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void. That really changes what's going on in Genesis 1. And that would be a legitimate translation, when God began. Here's another one. In the beginning of God's creation of the heaven and the earth, ... The earth was without form and void. It's very similar to the one above it, when God began. So these are 4 different translations that are all legitimate, that create a very different picture. So let's just think about the theological ramifications here of what all these different translations would mean. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, that's what we typically have. So you have in Genesis 1:1, God creates the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 verse 2, they've been created and now they're without form and void. Genesis 1 verse 3, he then says, let there be light. So this is typically how we would see this, in that this is all one episode of creation. Well, conversely, if we translate it as in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, there's this, it's kind of implying that, well, there was at one point a beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, and then after that, some other point, when he decided to start a new creation, the earth was without form and void. So this in a beginning kind of can work with that idea of a previous creation. The same thing with when God began. That can also put forth this idea of a previous creation. So when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void. So you get this idea of, well, when he began, as in when he began this time. Same thing with in the beginning of God's creation of the heaven and the earth. So I say this just to indicate that all 4 of these are legitimate ways to understand the Hebrew, but they mean very different things. This is why translation is hard, because you can look at this and say, oh boy, what do I do with this? Can you imagine being a Bible translator and you're sitting there and you're starting your job, right? And you open up to the first verse of the Bible and you're like, oh man, what do I do with this one? And just right at the beginning. And this is how every verse works. So Bible translation is complicated, and I want us to bring that out. So all of these are legitimate translations. Notice this last word, grammatically. So according to the Hebrew grammar, these are all legitimate translations. So the question then becomes, how do you decide? How do you decide which is an okay translation? Like which one to use? If they're all okay, but they mean different things, how do you know which it's supposed to be? Well, I think your major determinant should always be the context. So that means really that when you're translating, as a translator, you go through and you read the first verse and you think, whoa, what could this mean? Okay, this could mean this, 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 or this. Well, let's read the next verse and see if the next verse starts to explain what this verse means. And this is how you figure it out. You got to read one verse, then the next verse, and the next verse. And slowly, as you keep reading and building up the context, you start to get a picture. Let me show you what I mean by that. Genesis 1 verse 2 starts with this phrase, V'ha'aretz haita. This is not a normal phrase in Hebrew. This is what's called a disjunctive phrase. And a disjunctive phrase tells you this is like cutting off from what came before, and it's starting something new. So to me, this disjunctive phrase here, cutting off what came before and starting something new, is indicating that Genesis 1:1 is like an overview statement of, at some point in time, God created the heavens and the earth. In a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And now it's going to say, here's this parenthetical statement, this disjunctive statement. And the earth was, here's the next words, tohu vavohu, which is without form and void. Those words only show up one other time together. That's Jeremiah 4:23. And it's interesting that in Jeremiah 4:23, it's talking about what would happen to Israel when God destroyed them. So I feel like there's a contextual basis here to say, well, that's interesting. If I were translating Genesis 1:1, I would translate it as in a beginning, to imply that it's saying in a beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and now he's going to start another beginning. Let there be light, a different creation. So I think that there is basis based on the other verses around, based on the context here, to say that translation makes the most sense. Now, I'm not arguing necessarily that there was a previous creation. So I want to put that out there. I'm not trying to like extrapolate any theology here at this point. My goal is to just talk about how do you figure out how to translate things. So my point is, if I were translating Genesis 1:1, I would translate it as in a beginning. So we had our choices, and now we've chosen one based on the context. In addition, I think the literary structure kind of encourages us to see Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2 as something distinct outside of the 6 days. So this is something funny, which maybe you kind of noticed this as we were going through it. This is something funny about translation. It's sort of based on interpretation. You know, you try and interpret the verses and you say, okay, well, the translation of Genesis 1:1 like this makes sense with the translation of Genesis 1 verse 2. So my translation is based on how I understand the verses, right? It's kind of like the weird circular type of thing. So that's important to recognize. We often treat it like it's just about grammar. You know, this word should equal this. This word should equal this. But translation doesn't work that way. And so we end up saying things, you know, because we treat it like math. We say things like, oh, well, the translators were wrong, which if I can leave you with anything today, I really recommend that we try and get rid of this phrase from our vocabulary, just because this is, I don't know what goes through your mind if you ever say this, but I can tell you when I used to say things like this, I said it before I knew Greek or Hebrew. and before I realized, oh no, actually the translators weren't wrong. There were just 12 different ways that you could understand this sentence, and they chose one of them because they had to. So I think if we get rid of this idea, the translators were wrong, we'll be doing good. Or sometimes we say things like, I don't know what the translators were thinking. How could they translate it like that? And well, that's probably true. You don't know what they were thinking, but again, their translation was probably right. Or this is another one. This word really means, and no, actually, probably the translators knew what the word really meant. And so that's why they put it there. But the important piece for us to take from this is we don't want to mess around with translation if we're not experienced with it. I think that's a good idea because translation is complicated. So here's what I'm trying to say. This would be a better way to phrase things. Instead of saying the translators were wrong, we could say something like, another possible translation is ... This could also read ... And then explain, I think the context supports this translation because of these things. I just say this, you know, not like this is hugely important, but I think it's good for us because I know that for myself, it's very easy to become prideful unfortunately, when you're doing Bible studies, you know, that's kind of how it goes. And you think, oh, well, I obviously know better than anybody who's ever looked at this. I obviously know better than all the translators. So I'm going to translate this, even though I don't know Greek or Hebrew. I'm going to translate it better than they did. And you know, it's not a good path to go down. So I think if we say things like another possible translation is, or this could also read, that's probably a good plan. Now, here's the tricky part about all of this, right? So I said that translators have to choose one of these. And I suggested that I think in a beginning is the best choice. But when you choose one as a translator, look at what happens. When you choose which translation, all of a sudden, look at that. Somebody who picks up your English translation is only going to see that in the beginning. You know, if a translator chooses in the beginning, that's all that's left, right? Nobody has any clue that there were other possibilities. And that's one of the funny things about translating. When you translate, you're essentially, and this is just a downside of translating, you're essentially masking all the other possibilities. And so this is the next thing that I want us to take from this, right? It's important to approach translation with humility. In addition to that, recognize that translations, in some senses, are commentaries. Because a translator has to make a choice. Can you imagine what Genesis 1:1 or what the Bible would be like if you had all the possibilities listed out? Like, what if you opened up your Bible to Genesis 1:1 and there was a little marginal note there that said, you know, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, marginal note. And you look down and it said, this could actually read in a beginning, or it could read when God began to create, or it could read, you know, this, and heavens could be plural heavens, or it could be singular heavens, or it could be dual, you know, nobody would read that Bible, right? It would just, it would be too overwhelming. So I think if we can just recognize that so many verses are like this, and this is why it's important to read multiple versions, because multiple versions often bring out those different senses. Now, I just want to show you this because I thought that this was really interesting. This is from the King James Version preface. So this is the translators of the King James Version. And this is what they said about marginal notes, because they wanted to acknowledge this whole idea that sometimes there are verses that you just don't know, you know, is this the right way to translate or is this? And so that's why the King James Version has its marginal notes. So here's what they said. Some peradventure would have no variety of senses to be set in the margin. So let me translate that for you. So they're saying some people wouldn't want us to put other ways of translating this into the margin, lest the authority of the scriptures for deciding of controversies by that show of uncertainty should be somewhat shaken. So he said people wouldn't want this because they feel like it makes the Bible seem less authoritative, the translation, because the translators are saying, we don't really know. You know, we think it's this translation, but it could be this other one in the margin. But we hold their judgment not to be so sound in this point. It hath pleased God in his divine providence here and there to scatter words and sentences of that difficulty and doubtfulness, not in doctrinal points that concern salvation. I think that's a really important point. So they say, we can very clearly see true doctrine. You know, you can understand the gospel message, but in a lot of verses, there's little things here that you're trying to figure out. For in such it hath been vouched that the scriptures are plain, but in matters of less moment, that fearfulness would better beseem us than confidence. I like that last phrase there. Fearfulness would better beseem us than confidence. What that means is, so we should approach Bible translation with fear instead of confidence. And I think that's a really good attitude. So they go on to explain. There be many words in the scriptures, apax legomena, that's the Greek. This is what we call, when we're translating, these are the words that only show up one time ever. So they said, which be never found there but once, having neither brother nor neighbor, as the Hebrews speak, so that we cannot be holpen by conference of places. So what you do when you're translating is you say, okay, where else is this word used? And so what sense can I get for what this word means? The problem is that if this word only shows up one time ever, there's nothing to consult. So they say there's these words, these hapax legomenas, these words that only show up one time. And we don't really know if we translated them correctly because they only showed up once. So we're going to point out to you, when we see those, we're going to point out in the margin, we don't know if this was right. Again, there be many rare names of certain birds, beasts, and precious stones, etc., concerning which the Hebrews themselves are so divided among themselves for judgment. And so this might be, if you've ever noticed, like, you know, when you're reading the King James and it talks about like that they built the tabernacle out of porpoise skins and all these things, like all these weird animals, or like in Job, it talks about the unicorn, right? Like there was no unicorn. But these guys, these translators were trying to figure out, what is this? We have no idea what this is talking about. Now, in such a case, doth not a margin do well to admonish the reader to seek further and not to conclude or dogmatize upon this or that peremptorily? For as it is a fault of incredulity to doubt of those things that are evident, so to determine of such things as the Spirit of God hath left, even in the judgment of the judicious, questionable, can be no less than presumption. Okay. That last sentence is awesome and ridiculously complicated. So what they say there is, they say it proves disbelief if you doubt the things that are clearly not meant to be understood, that are clearly not meant to be understood, but clearly meant to be questioned, right? They say it's not right to try and create, this dogmatism out of something that we clearly don't quite know yet. So they say that's no less than presumption. So I think it's just important to recognize that even they, the King James translators, said there were some cases where we just didn't know, and we pointed those out to you. So this is why it's important for us to understand what translation is, because without it, we might just say, oh, well, I'm a King James guy forever, or I'm an ESV guy, and that's all I'll ever read. And that is not a good practice, because what we do when we restrict ourselves to that is we suddenly cut off the range of meaning of the Hebrew and the Greek. There's a huge range, as we saw from Genesis 1:1, and reading other translations will show that to us. But if we only ever read one, then the whole range of meanings is suddenly constricted. Okay. So I want to give you an example of this, just to illustrate how other translations can help. This is a verse I always read growing up. I was a King James guy through and through. And I always wondered, why does the Bible say this? So it says, and Saul tarried in the uttermost part of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. People that were with him were about 600 men. What's up with that? It's not like it's significant at all that he's under a pomegranate tree, but for some reason, scripture mentions that. Why does it say that? And I kept reading through the King James, and eventually I even planted some pomegranate trees in my yard. And I got this idea that maybe scripture says pomegranate tree because the pomegranate tree is kind of like a little bush. So it was like Saul was hiding or something. But a pomegranate tree isn't really like a little bush. That was just because I had only had them in my yard for like a year. They're definitely not little bushes anymore. So I then got another translation, and I started reading the ESV when I did my daily readings. And one day I noticed this. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel like a tree and a cave are very different things. So when you see that, right, you've always read a tree, and then all of a sudden you're reading another translation and it says cave, you got to say, whoa, what's going on there? Here's a New American Standard. It says tree. And look at this one. This is Young's Literal. It says, Saul is abiding at the extremity of Gibeah under the pomegranate, which is in Migron. And that one just sounds really crazy. It sounds like there's like some big, huge pomegranate like floating in the air, and Saul's just sitting under it. Like, what does that mean? The point is that when you notice these differences in translation, that's when you can say, I bet there's a range of meaning here. And there's something deeper for me to learn, something deeper for me to find out. And in fact, there is. Because that word there, pomegranate tree, as Young's Literal indicated, is actually just harimon, which in Hebrew is the pomegranate, harimon. Here's why this is interesting. In Judges 20, verse 47, you might remember the story. Judges chapter 19 is the story of the Levite and his concubine. You remember that when the concubine dies and he cuts her up and sends her throughout the land and all of that. And then Judges chapter 20 there's a war because of that whole situation with the Levite and a concubine. It's the men of Benjamin versus everyone else. In fact, it's not just the men of Benjamin, it's the men of Benjamin specifically from the city of Gibeah. Now that's interesting. Did you notice where Saul was in 1 Samuel 14, verse 2? He was in Gibeah. Now, take a look at this. Judges 20, verse 47. It says that these men of Gibeah, 600 of them, turned and fled to the wilderness unto the rock Rimmon, and abode in the rock Rimmon for 4 months. Now, that's intriguing because pomegranate there in 1 Samuel 14, verse 2, is the word ha-rimmon. It's Rimmon. So now we have 2 links, men of Gibeah and pomegranate tree. And in fact, this says that there were 600 men and 600 men. In other words, what's going on here is 1 Samuel 14:2 is actually a repeat of Judges 20, verse 47. And you see this. What got us started on this was looking at other translations, because I think the ESV actually noticed the connection. Do you remember the ESV translation? It said, Saul was in the pomegranate cave, which is Judges 20, verse 47, the rock Rimmon. In other words, I think what scripture is trying to get us to see is that Saul had become like his ancestors. These people in Judges 20, verse 47, these were the Benjamites. These were Saul's ancestors. And Saul had become like that. Okay. So there was an example of how that works. So just to summarize this section here, when we make a decision, it obscures other possibilities. And so we lose some of the range of meaning. So that's why we should use multiple translations. I think the next question then becomes, okay, if that's the case, then which? Which should we use? Okay. I sat down and tried to think about, how does somebody decide how to translate a passage? And you see there at the top, number 1, the context, right? That's what we talked about earlier. But it's a little more complicated than that, because in a lot of professionally done translations that we have, you can't just, one person doesn't just translate it. There's a translation philosophy that guides the entire committee. And then sometimes the translator's personal context also affect the translation. Sometimes the translator's beliefs affect the translation. And sometimes the translation committee itself, they have to vote. And the translation committee will say, well, the majority thinks this, so that's how we're going to do it. And that's how it ends up. So these are the factors that I put together as far as what influences which translation you choose out of the range of meaning. And what I want to talk about tonight are number 2 and 3, translation philosophy and translator's personal contexts. We'll see how far we get in these. Hey, Chad, as far as when we started, I was intending to go for like another 10 minutes. And then do questions. Is that about right? Would you say? Or
yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
That sounds good. Okay.
Yep.
All right. We'll see how far we get. See how it goes. So let's talk about translation philosophy. Okay. So this is really a committee's methodology. It's like they're agreed upon. This is what we're going to do when we translate. Here's how we're going to translate it. So these are the questions that they have to think about. What's our goal? Is it to create a Bible that is good for reading in public? Is it to create a Bible that's good for personal study? Or is it to create a Bible that's good for just like devotional reading? These all affect a translation differently, these goals. Then they have to ask themselves, who's the audience? There's some translations that are for English language learners, right? So who's the audience? That's going to make a big difference. Or is it like professors or something like that? So let's go back to our Spanish example. And let's talk about some translation philosophies. So I put up there above these translations in Spanish, I put formal equivalents and functional equivalents. Now, we typically refer to formal equivalents as literal, right? I have hunger. The chicken likes me. That's literally translating that Spanish there. So that's what is called now in linguistics. It's called formal equivalents. Typically, we would call functional equivalents, we'd call that dynamic. Sometimes we use the words thought for thought. We also use the word paraphrase. So let's see how this works out. I really like this chart. This is from a book called How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth. It's by Gordon Fee and Mark Strauss, who are two of the translators of the NIV. So this chart, they lay out the formal equivalents versus functional equivalents, so on the left and on the right. And they give you a few examples of each. They also have a middle column called mediating. And by mediating, what they mean is a Bible that attempts to balance formal equivalents and functional equivalents. So trying to do both, trying to get the best of both worlds. And they list there your strengths and your weaknesses. So we're going to go through and try both. Now, you might notice there that they appear to appreciate the mediating version the best, which makes sense because they were the translators of the NIV. Okay, here's another chart that I thought was helpful, just because this is specifically a spectrum, right? You have on the left the more formal, and on the right the more functional, and it lists, King James, ASV, and then moving down the spectrum, NASB, New King James, ESV. So I thought that's helpful. Sometimes you will see translations like this or charts like this, and I wanted to just point out that I'm not a huge fan of this chart, specifically because linguists are moving away from this term over here, paraphrase. So you'll see that this says word for word, thought for thought, paraphrase versus formal equivalents and functional equivalents. People are moving away from those terms. Paraphrase, the reason why is because it's quite a confusing description, because it also tends to mean a translation that's not actually a translation. So let me read you this quote here. It says, "We should also note that linguists sometimes use paraphrase in a third sense, contrasting it with translation. Well, translation is transferring a message from one language to another, so Hebrew to English or Greek to English. Paraphrase is rewording a message in the same language. By this definition, the Living Bible is a true paraphrase, since Kenneth Taylor started with an English version, the American Standard Version, and reworded and simplified it. Other functional equivalent versions would be true translations, since they were rendered not from an English version, but directly from the Hebrew and Greek." So sometimes we get a little confused on this, and we'll say things like, oh, well, the Message Bible, that was a paraphrase. Well, it's not actually, because it was translated from the Hebrew and from the Greek. The Living Bible, as it mentions here, is a paraphrase. And it is a paraphrase because it was never translated. It was just this man, Kenneth Taylor, reading the American Standard Version and trying to create a version in English from an English version that his kids could understand. So that's a paraphrase. Here's another explanation of it that I thought was quite good. Okay, this was wrong. It should say reading God's word for all it's worth. That's the book that it came from. So it says here, in addition to the two main approaches to translation discussed above, so formal versus functional equivalents, you'll encounter what's known as a paraphrase. Technically, a paraphrase is not a translation from the original languages at all, but merely a restatement or explanation of a particular English translation using different English words. The Living Bible, perhaps the most famous paraphrase, is Kenneth Taylor's restatement of the ASV for the benefit of his children. Another well-known paraphrase, the Amplified Bible, tries to give the reader an understanding of the many meanings contained in a particular verse through the creative use of amplification. For instance, John 11:25 reads, "Jesus said to her, 'I am myself the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in, adheres to, trusts in, and relies on me, although he may die, yet he shall live.' This looks very much like the overload fallacy, which assumes that a word will bring its full range of meaning into every context. The Amplified Bible leaves the misleading impression that the reader is free to choose from among the options presented." So that's a paraphrase. Okay, so that's one part of translation philosophy. Do you go with functional equivalents or formal equivalents? Do you try and strike a balance in the middle? which direction do you want to lean to? In addition to that, what do you do when the same Hebrew or Greek word has a different sense? So do you always try and translate one Hebrew word in the same way every time? Or do you always try and translate the same Greek word in the same way every time? How do you do that? What do you do with quotations? So when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, do you make those sound exactly the same, even if the Greek is slightly different than what the Hebrew says? What about this one? What do you do with punctuation? You know, Paul has like a 13-verse sentence or something like that at the beginning of Ephesians. What do you do with that? You know, are you going to give like a Bible for children? Are you going to give them a 13-verse long sentence? Well, you know, it's one of those things of trying to figure that out. So that's where translation philosophy is important. Or this is another one. What about inclusive gender? Now, I don't want to sound weird, so let me explain what this is. The inclusive gender is the recognition that almost all languages, when they say men, they really mean people. They really mean men and women. You know, when Paul's writing and he says brothers, that doesn't mean that he's solely talking to the men. Maybe sometimes, you know, if he's talking specifically about something that concerns them. But usually when he says, I was happy to write to you, brothers, he's not just saying, oh, and sisters, you're not allowed to read this because it wasn't written to you, right? So what does the translation do about that? Okay, so when we get a version, we want to learn about its translation philosophy. And we can do that by taking a look at the preface. So I wanted to take a look at what the ESV does. Here's the ESV preface. So they explain here, the ESV is an essentially literal translation that seeks as far as possible to reproduce the precise wording in the original text in the personal style of each Bible writer. As such, its emphasis is on a word-for-word correspondence, at the same time taking full account of differences in grammar, syntax, and idiom between current literary English and the original languages. Thus, it seeks to be transparent to the original text, letting the reader see as directly as possible the structure and exact force of the original. Okay, so they're saying basically that they lean towards the formal equivalence. Then they tell you about what they do for punctuation. So they try and make the English make the most sense. So they rely mostly on how the English works in terms of punctuation. And they talk about gender as well. So in the ESV preface, it says, in the area of gender language, the goal of the ESV is to render literally what is in the original. For example, anyone replaces any man when there is no word corresponding to man in the original languages. And people, rather than men, is regularly used, where the original languages both refer to men and women. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. Here's 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10 in the King James. It says, now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And we're so used to reading that we read it and we say, oh yeah, you know, he's talking to the whole ecclesia. Some people might not be though. So the ESV says, I appeal to you, brothers, and then it includes a note, a footnote that says, or brothers and sisters. In New Testament usage, depending on the context, the plural Greek word adelphoi, translated brothers, may refer either to brothers or to brothers and sisters. Also verses 11 and 26. Here's the new RSV. So the new RSV just takes it a step further. So the new RSV says, now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So when you're choosing a translation or thinking about what translation to use, it's helpful to know what is their translation philosophy, because you can understand, are they going towards formal equivalence? Are they going towards functional equivalence? What do they do in terms of punctuation? What do they do in terms of gender, in terms of that kind of language? Well, and then what philosophy is best really depends on what you want to use it for. Oh man, my time is up. Okay, let me just finish this section real quick. So it really depends on what you want to use it for. So here's the advantage of formal equivalence. Here's your Greek word sarx. There's your Strong's number. Here it is in Romans 8:13 in the King James. For if you live after the flesh, you shall die. Here it is in Romans 9, verse 8, King James. They which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God. Here it is in Romans 11:14. Paul says, which are my flesh, and might save some of them. You'll notice that this Greek word sarx in all three of these places has been translated as flesh. One, Paul is talking about living after the flesh. Two, Paul is talking about the children of the flesh. And that doesn't, mean like sinful children, but it means just physical descent. And the third one, he's talking about Israelites, his kinsmen. So you get to decide, though, if there's a link. You're reading this and you can see that, oh, this word is always translated flesh, right? This is the same Greek word. Well, by comparison, take a look at the NIV. Same verses. If you live according to the flesh, so they translate sarx as flesh there. Look at what they do in 9 verse 8. They change it to physical descent, because that's probably what it's talking about. But you don't get to be the one who determines that as the reader. They determine it. Romans 11:14, you will notice that it says, somehow arouse my own people. So you lose that connection of flesh, 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 right? They try and make it make more sense, but you lose that link. So the advantage of formal equivalence is you can often see links between passages and words. The advantage of functional equivalence is it often makes more sense. So take a look at this. And again, I said I grew up reading the King James, so I think I'm used to this. But when I stepped back and thought about what this meant, this was actually kind of funny. Think about this verse. It says, it was so, when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, God gave him another heart. I mean, it sounds like Saul had like all of a sudden like heart surgery or something. Like, boom, he was given another heart. It's funny the way it puts it, right? But that's a literal translation. God gave him another heart. Here's the ESV, right? ESV is literal. It's formally equivalent. God gave him another heart. Now read it in the NIV. God changed Saul's heart. I got to say, that makes way more sense. That God changed his heart rather than he gave him another heart, as if his heart was like bad or he had a heart attack or something. 2 Samuel 18:25. Here's another example. The watchman cried and told the king. The king said, if he be alone, so there's a runner coming towards him, and the king says, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. That sounds really funny. Can you just imagine like somebody munching on tidings? Like whatever that is going on there. Here's the ESV. If he's alone, there is news in his mouth. Here's what the NIV says. If he's alone, he must have good news. Again, that makes significantly more sense than tidings in his mouth or news in his mouth. Here is one that I think is very good. It says, next unto him was Karshena, Shathar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face and which sat first in the kingdom. Now, this sounds, if you were to just read this verse, this sounds like only some people ever saw the king's face. Like he wore a veil over it or something. And sometimes, he'd show his face to people. These people saw the king's face. The ESV does the same thing. So, you can't say, oh, well, I'll read a newer translation and this will fix it. So it's the same thing. They saw the king's face. The NIV, getting the sense of what's going on here, instead says, who had special access to the king. So you can see, again, the difference. So this is the advantage of functional equivalence. Now, I put too much in, alas. Okay, I want to just show you this. I think this shows why we need to use both. This is 1 Peter 1:13 in the King James. It says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. Have you ever wondered what that means? Like last time I checked, my mind did not have loins. So, I'm like, what is this talking about? Gird up the loins of your mind. And yet, by reading it in the King James, you could probably figure out that there's an allusion there to Exodus 12:11, where God says, eat the Passover with your loins girded. Get ready to go, is what he's saying. That's interesting because Peter has a whole bunch of Exodus allusions. Question, though, is, what does it mean to gird up the loins of your mind? So by reading the King James, we could say, aha, look, there's this link here to the Exodus. And that's important. That's helpful. But we don't yet know what this means. So if you read the NIV, you then get, therefore, with minds that are alert. Ah, now I can understand that. So what I think we're being shown here, what I take out of this is this same verse has advantages when we read it in a formal equivalent translation and when we read it in a functional equivalent translation. And so what I want us to see in all of this, the big lesson to take is Translation is complicated. And that's why we need to read multiple translations. Don't just only carry around your King James. You know, bring your King James one Sunday, bring your ESV the next Sunday, bring your NIV the next one, you know, and read out of different translations, because as you do that, you are going to develop a sense for the range of meaning that if you just read one translation, you won't see it all. Okay, so I'm going to end there.